The second required document that we're going to have to deal with is a little more complicated. We're not going to spend any time reading it. We just need to know the main issues with it, and that would be the Articles of Confederation. You guys would have handled this in U.S. history class last year. I know you're pretty familiar with this, but the Articles of Confederation, this is our first plan of government for the United States colonies. So this is the plan that was used to design the government immediately after the Declaration of Independence, and so that would be from 1776, and it lasted until 1787 when the Constitution replaced it. And so initially, this was the form of government that the leadership thought was best, and what we'll see is that they made a lot of pretty obvious mistakes. First, we want to just take a general look at the structure of the government that was created by the Articles here. So this set up a confederation. We learned on our first day that a confederation is a loose alliance of independent states. And so the states were, loosely working together here, but were mostly their own dominion where they were. Each state sent representatives to Congress, which is the only branch of the national government. There is not a separate president. There is not a judicial branch. And so the members of Congress get together and they elect someone as president of Congress, which makes this a parliamentary form of government. But this Congress really had no power and a lot of structural problems. One of the biggest problems, each state was allowed one vote. So we've got a couple of huge states like New York and Virginia who have the same power as very small states. And so we've got 13 states here that each have one vote in the Congress, and they're not going to agree on a lot of things. So it's going to be difficult to pass laws. And they're missing a couple of really important things here. There's no functional way to deal with economic planning. So every state has their own economic plan. And think about those states in the Northeast. That's not useful. You have tiny states like Connecticut and Rhode Island, which would do better if the economy was planned regionally. And you're going to have some states that are very successful. And at this time, those would be all the southern states who had good climates for agriculture. And those states in the north who had yet to develop industry had really struggling economies. But the states won't work together. The other thing here is if you're a different country, right, and you want to deal with the United States, it's hard to figure out who's in charge. Each state kind of does their own thing, even in foreign relations. And so this is a government that lacks the two main functions of our national government today, which would be economic planning and dealing with foreign policy. We have 5 basic problems that are in the Articles of Confederation that we need to make sure we can remember. The first of those is taxing. An obvious thing that a government needs is ability to raise money. And the Articles of Confederation does not allow the national government to tax the states. So the states can give money, they can volunteer money if they want to, but that doesn't happen a lot. So there's very little money for the United States government to function. Each state does their own thing. There's not a military unless there's a war. There's a ban on a peacetime army. And so if a problem arises, it's very difficult to respond to that problem quickly. Currency is a major problem. Think about how easy it is for you to spend money in different states. You don't even think about it. But in this system, each state had their own currency. Like they had their own dollars and coins and stuff. If you wanted to spend money in a different state, you had to get your money changed out. And that makes regional trade impossible. That makes global trade impossible. These states are all doing that on their own. So when it came time to decide how to pass laws, they wanted to make sure that most states agreed. And so this requirement here says that 3/4 of states have to agree to a law in order for it to be passed. And the result of this is that almost no policy was passed in this 11-year period of the national government. You history folks there's like one law that you had to learn that happened under this government, and that was the Northwest Ordinance. The only thing they could agree on was making a plan for new lands to be added as states in the future. Other than that, this Congress passed almost nothing because 3/4 of states is a really high number to agree on some policy to be made. And even worse than that is the amendments here. If you wanted to make a change to the Articles of Confederation itself, every single state had to agree on that. We're going to come back and talk about this one a lot because that makes it really hard to solve any of these problems that are in the Articles of Confederation. So outside of the Articles itself, there is this one issue that pops up in Massachusetts. I'm sure you had to learn about it in history class. We don't really care about the details here. What happens is there's an uprising that should be a minor problem. This is in Massachusetts. These guys, they're mad about something. They take over different government buildings in town. The problem is that there is no standing army in the United States. If Massachusetts is unable to solve this problem by themselves, which they were, then the other states aren't just going to jump in and help, and there's no U.S. Army to come in and help Massachusetts, the state. So this little bitty problem, should have been a little bitty problem, lasted almost a year. All we want to know about Shaes Rebellion is that this was the last straw for people who weren't sure about if the Articles of Confederation government was working or not. So this finally shows people that the Articles of Confederation just weren't practical because you can't solve problems without any national power at all. And so Shaes Rebellion is a huge cause of the Constitutional Convention, where they're writing the Constitution to replace the Articles of Confederation. All right, so remember where I said that amendments had to be unanimous. That's a huge deal. That means that any state could veto any change to the Articles at all, which basically means that it's impossible to change the Articles of Confederation. When they finally have a Constitutional Convention, Rhode Island refuses to even send a person to talk about it. So we already know right there, Rhode Island doesn't even agree with the idea of changing it, so none of the changes are going to get passed. So what happens? The framers here, the people that are leading this convention, mostly James Madison, decides we're just going to replace the Articles of Confederation totally. We're not going to make changes to it. We're going to replace it with a completely new plan. One of the important parts of the Constitution you guys learned is Article 7 tells us how to ratify the Constitution. It requires 3/4 of the states to ratify the Constitution. Okay, keep in mind, under the Articles of Confederation, 3/4 of states had to agree to pass a law. So this kind of works under the old system. They'd agreed that if 3/4 of states agreed to a policy, then that policy could go into effect. And here we are with the Constitution. They write a whole new plan of government and say, you can put this into effect if 3/4 of states agree. That's 9 out of 13 states here. What happens is the Constitution replaces the whole system of government. Eventually, it got the approval of all 13 colonies, and now ultimately 50 states have ratified the United States Constitution. Now, what we're going to get into later is we're going to talk about how important it is that New York and Virginia, they were the biggest states. So even though 9 out of 13 states had to agree, then it was official. If New York and Virginia didn't like this plan, it was not going to happen. So we're going to deal with that when we talk about the Federalist Papers. All right, so that's the Articles of Confederation. This is going to be really important in our Constitution unit. We're going to have to specifically talk about what were the problems, and then as we go through the Constitution itself, we need to be able to explain how does the Constitution solve those specific problems. So keep the structure of government in mind, and especially focus on those 5 problems with the Articles of Confederation, because we've got specific answers to those problems in the Constitution itself.